Jordan Baxter always believed that home was more than four walls and a neatly trimmed lawn. It was a living, breathing extension of one's soul. A passionate entrepreneur and self-taught horticulturist, Jordan's pride and joy was the sprawling pumpkin patch that bordered his charming, century-old farmhouse. Every autumn, as golden sunlight danced on the ripened orange globes, his garden transformed into a whimsical celebration of harvest. Jordan had spent years perfecting his craft, nurturing each pumpkin with a care usually reserved for rare orchids. His commitment had even earned him a modest reputation in town as the Pumpkin Maestro, a title he wore with equal parts pride and humility. In the crisp early mornings, while dew still clung to the vine leaves and the scent of earth mingled with promise, Jordan would be out among the rows, checking his produce, jotting notes on growth patterns, and imagining the festive tables his pumpkins would one day grace. Beyond their culinary and decorative value, these pumpkins symbolized a personal history, memories of long-ago family harvests, community gatherings in a time before overregulation, and a legacy of independent spirit. His farmhouse, with its weathered wooden beams and sprawling gardens, was his sanctuary, a place where creativity met tradition. But even the purest sanctuaries can be besieged by those who live by rules rather than heart. Enter Kerren, notorious around the neighborhood for her strict, unwavering adherence to the HOA's sometimes absurd regulations. Kerren had long ruled over the community with an iron fist in lace gloves. As the self-appointed guardian of proper suburban aesthetics, she believed that every inch of the neighborhood should mirror her idea of perfection. Over time, her overzealous efforts to maintain order morphed into petty micromanagement, and one of her most recent targets was Jordan's beloved pumpkin patch. It began subtly enough. One autumn morning, Jordan discovered that a few of his prized pumpkins were missing. At first, he assumed a stray animal or a gust of mischief had played its part. But as days passed, more pumpkins vanished, always leaving behind a gap where the vibrant orbs once sat. Suspicion, and then certainty, slowly crept into Jordan's mind. Someone was deliberately pilfering his pumpkins. The evidence was as clear as the rising sun over his dewy rows, and all signs pointed to a singular culprit: Kerren, the HOA president. Their first confrontation unfolded on a blustery fall afternoon. Jordan, with a mix of trepidation and righteous anger, marched up to the HOA office, a small, overly sterile building that seemed to have little room for creativity, much like its director. There, behind a mahogany desk adorned with crisp rulebooks and even crisper rules, sat Kerren. Dressed in a tailored blazer and pearls, she exuded an air of superiority that made Jordan's skin prickle. "Jordan Baxter," she began in a measured tone that brooked no dissent, "it has come to our attention that your property is in violation of community standards." Her eyes glinted with self-satisfaction as she slid a thick envelope across the desk. Inside was a formal warning citing an obscure regulation about unsightly produce display and the unspoken rule that every homeowner must conform to a sterile, uniform aesthetic. Jordan's voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a deep-seated indignation. "Kerren, my pumpkins aren't a menace. They're a celebration of harvest and life. They're part of my home, my legacy. And frankly, you've been taking them." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the rustle of paper as Kerren adjusted her glasses. "Taking them," she scoffed, arching a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "I'm merely ensuring that the neighborhood is free from distractions. These pumpkins, as charming as you may think, disrupt the uniformity we strive to maintain." Her tone was as cold as the autumn wind outside, dismissive of Jordan's heartfelt explanation. It was that moment, the spark in the eyes of a man who refused to let bureaucratic tyranny crush his passion, when the true battle lines were drawn. Jordan realized that this was no mere difference in opinion. It was an all-out war between personal tradition and an entitled system determined to homogenize every inch of the community. And as Kerren's voice dripped with condescension, Jordan silently vowed that he would not only fight for his pumpkins, but for the soul of his home. Stepping out of the stifling office, Jordan's thoughts churned with a mix of hurt and resolve. Every lost pumpkin was not just a crop taken. It was a piece of his heritage being snatched away by someone who cared more about arbitrary rules than genuine community spirit. That day, beneath a sky heavy with promise and defiance, Jordan Baxter's peaceful life began to fracture. Little did Kerren know, the seeds of rebellion had already been sown in his heart, ready to bloom into a spectacle of spicy, fiery justice. The very next morning, the battle escalated in a way Jordan could scarcely have predicted. At his front door, tucked under the persistent drizzle of an autumn rain, he found an official-looking envelope bearing the crest of the neighborhood HOA. Inside, a meticulously typed notice demanded that he cease all unauthorized horticultural displays and warned of an impending fine if he did not comply immediately. The fine? A staggering $750, justified by some arcane bylaw concerning exterior visual uniformity. Jordan's pulse pounded as he scanned the document. The language was cold and legalistic, a far cry from the warmth of his pumpkin patch. Yet it was Kerren's handwriting, looping and pristine, that seemed to seal his fate. In her eyes, as she had demonstrated the previous day, every slight against the neighborhood's aesthetic was a personal affront. And now, by targeting his pumpkins, she was declaring war. Determined not to be bullied, Jordan resolved to fight back. He spent that morning poring over local zoning laws, municipal regulations, and even obscure county ordinances. He discovered that not only were his pumpkins legally protected as part of his private property, but that the HOA's restrictions had little to no standing in the eyes of the law. His frustration mingled with a fierce pride. He knew his home, and its traditions were worth defending. Later that day, as the rain gave way to a pale, reluctant sun, Kerren made her next power move. Standing at the edge of Jordan's property, arms folded and an imperious smile fixed on her lips, she greeted him with a rehearsed tone of superiority. "Jordan, I trust you received our notice. It's imperative that you adhere to the community guidelines. We cannot have individual whims undermining the collective order." "Guidelines?" Jordan shot back, voice firm yet measured. "These aren't guidelines. They're arbitrary rules that strip us of our right to celebrate who we are. My pumpkins are my tradition, and you're wrong to think they are a blemish on our community." His words were laced with both defiance and the calm of someone who had done his homework. Kerren's response was as icy as ever. "The rules apply to everyone, Jordan. Your personal preferences do not exempt you from the standards set forth for the benefit of all." Her tone left no room for debate, as if the very fabric of the neighborhood depended on unquestioning obedience. Before Jordan could further press his case, a dark sedan pulled up. Two stern-faced inspectors, summoned by Kerren's insistence on upholding the HOA's edicts, stepped out and began a detailed, invasive examination of his property. They measured the spacing between his garden's edging, scrutinized the placement of each pumpkin, and took copious notes, as though his humble patch were the site of a federal investigation. Every moment felt like a scene from an oppressive dystopia. Neighbors peered from behind drawn curtains, whispering about how Kerren's grip on the community had grown dangerously tight. Jordan, though intimidated by the legal machine now descending upon him, maintained a quiet dignity. "I'm simply growing my pumpkins," he told one inspector, "and every one of them stands as a testament to years of hard work and passion." Yet, as the inspectors filed their reports and Kerren watched with a smug nod, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The HOA's first power move had been executed flawlessly, an unmistakable message that dissent would not be tolerated. The fine was not merely a financial penalty. It was a symbol of control, a reminder that in this meticulously governed neighborhood, personal expression was an unwelcome disruption. That evening, as Jordan sat on his back porch with a cup of bitter coffee, the weight of the day's events pressed on him. The official notice lay on the table like an insult in black and white. But even in the gloom of regulatory oppression, a spark of determination began to kindle. He realized that if Kerren and the HOA sought to strip away his legacy, he would have to fight not just with legal documents and quiet defiance, but with a plan that would hit them where it hurt most, in the very heart of their absurdity. As twilight deepened, Jordan's mind raced with ideas of retribution. The thought of his pumpkins, symbols of life and freedom, being reduced to mere violations on paper was unbearable. In that quiet, reflective moment, the seeds of a counterattack were planted. He vowed that he would not only reclaim what was rightfully his, but also expose the hypocrisy behind every rule and fine that had been doled out in the name of community order. And though the coming days promised conflict and confrontation, Jordan's resolve grew stronger, fueled by the belief that sometimes the only way to defeat tyranny was to fight fire with a little extra spice. What had begun as a quiet dispute over pumpkins soon spiraled into an all-consuming battle for freedom and dignity. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around Jordan's patch grew tense and charged. Kerren, unyielding and ever ambitious, decided that subtle warnings were no longer sufficient. Instead, she launched a series of power moves that not only threatened Jordan's livelihood, but also exposed the deeper rot within the HOA's management. It started with a barrage of new violation notices that arrived at Jordan's doorstep, each more baseless than the last. One day, he opened his mail to find a letter accusing him of aggressive landscaping practices, simply because his pumpkin patch had become a vibrant, unruly burst of color in an otherwise muted neighborhood. Another day, an envelope arrived stating that the natural growth of vines along his fence constituted an illegal encroachment on community-owned green space. The sheer audacity of these claims stung deeply. Kerren's tactics grew bolder. She began threatening eviction proceedings if Jordan did not immediately correct his property. Rumors circulated among the neighbors that she was preparing a dossier of violations against him, complete with photos and doctored reports. Some residents, previously silent or even supportive of Jordan's independent spirit, began to question his methods, fearing that his defiance might lead to a crackdown on the entire community. Yet, even as whispers of dissent circulated, a few brave souls confessed in hushed tones that they, too, had suffered under Kerren's ruthless enforcement of outdated rules. Determined to expose the underlying corruption, Jordan set out on his own investigation. Late one night, armed with a discreet camera and an unwavering resolve, he began documenting every irregularity. He recorded meetings where Kerren and a select few board members discussed reallocating funds from community events to cover their mounting legal fees. In one hushed conversation, a nervous board member confided that Kerren had been using HOA money for her personal luxuries, expensive dinners, new wardrobe pieces, and even a weekend getaway at a boutique resort. The evidence was damning. As Jordan delved deeper, he discovered patterns of manipulation and deceit. The same inspectors who had ransacked his property were now seen on multiple occasions casually overlooking far more egregious violations on properties owned by friends of the board. It became clear that Kerren's vendetta against him was as much about consolidating her power as it was about enforcing arbitrary standards. With every new piece of evidence, Jordan's determination grew stronger. He wasn't just defending a pumpkin patch anymore. He was challenging an entrenched system of entitlement and corruption. During one particularly heated HOA meeting, a gathering meant to resolve community issues, Jordan boldly raised his concerns. In a packed room filled with anxious neighbors and a smug Kerren presiding over the proceedings, he laid out his findings. He spoke passionately about the sanctity of his home, the beauty of natural, unregulated growth, and the absurdity of penalizing life itself. His voice, steady and resolute, resonated with those who had silently borne the brunt of Kerren's oppressive policies. But Kerren was not one to be easily outdone. With a theatrical flourish, she denounced Jordan's evidence as misinterpreted coincidences and baseless paranoia. Her rebuttals were slick and rehearsed, relying on legal jargon and an appeal to tradition. Yet, as she spoke, a few board members exchanged uneasy glances. The veneer of perfection was cracking, and Jordan's evidence was too compelling to ignore completely. Outside the meeting, the fallout was immediate. Neighbors who had once regarded Jordan's pumpkin patch as an eccentric hobby now saw it as a symbol of resistance. Conversations in hushed tones turned to public outcry, with many residents quietly rallying behind him. For Jordan, every stolen pumpkin and every fabricated violation notice became ammunition in his fight for justice. Even as Kerren's tactics grew increasingly desperate, the community's support began to shift, albeit slowly, like the turning of a season. That night, as Jordan reviewed his recordings and notes by the soft glow of his desk lamp, he realized that the battle was no longer just his. It was a fight for the very soul of the neighborhood, a stand against a system that prized conformity over creativity, bureaucracy over heart. In the flicker of that lamp, amid the quiet hum of resistance, Jordan vowed that he would expose every injustice, every lie, until the corrupt foundation of the HOA was brought crashing down. And somewhere in the back of his mind, an even bolder plan began to take shape, one that would turn the tables in a way that no one, not even Kerren, could have ever anticipated. Just when it seemed the escalating feud might simmer down to a bureaucratic stalemate, Kerren and her cronies decided to push past every conceivable boundary. One crisp morning, as the first hints of winter crept into the air, Jordan awoke to a scene that bordered on the surreal. Heavy machinery was parked near his driveway, and his prized delivery truck, integral for transporting his pumpkins to local markets, had been towed away. A crude sign on his property warned that unauthorized vehicles would be removed without notice. It was a bold, unmistakable act of intimidation. By midday, the situation had worsened. Without warning, the HOA turned off the irrigation system that Jordan had painstakingly installed to nurture his patch. The once thriving rows of pumpkin vines began to wilt, their leaves curling in distress under the sudden deprivation. For a man whose livelihood and passion were intertwined with every vine and fruit, the act felt personal, a deliberate assault on the very heart of his home. Yet Jordan was not one to crumble under pressure. In the midst of these provocations, a new idea germinated, a plan both audacious and deliciously ironic. If Kerren's objective was to make his pumpkins undesirable, then he would weaponize their uniqueness in a way she could never anticipate. Late that evening, while the community slept and the sound of distant sirens echoed like a warning, Jordan began preparing his secret countermeasure. Carefully mixing an extra spicy chili oil recipe he'd perfected over years of culinary experimentation, he methodically coated each remaining pumpkin in his patch. The oil was potent, a blend of fiery habanero, cayenne, and secret spices meant to transform ordinary pumpkins into a gauntlet of taste and retribution. At first, the process was almost meditative. Jordan worked under the fading light, the pungent aroma of chili mingling with the earthy fragrance of pumpkins. Each brushstroke was an act of defiance, a promise that those who sought to undermine him would find no victory here. With every pumpkin gleaming under its fiery glaze, Jordan felt a surge of empowerment. These were no longer just crops, they were symbols of his stand against an oppressive regime. The next HOA meeting, held in the community's sterile town hall, was charged with an electric tension. Neighbors filed into the room, their whispers of discontent barely contained. Kerren took her place at the head of the table, her eyes sharp and unyielding, determined to reassert her authority. But as the meeting unfolded, Jordan strode in carrying a thick folder of legal documents, damning evidence of the HOA's, and especially Kerren's, unlawful actions. The room fell into a heavy silence as he laid out his case, complete with photographs, audio recordings, and footage of unauthorized actions. Then came the moment Jordan had been building toward. In a measured yet daring voice, he announced that his pumpkins, now transformed into spicy symbols of protest, would be distributed to any who dared to support his cause. These aren't just pumpkins, he declared, they're a taste of defiance. Each one is laced with a warning. You can't take our traditions and twist them into tools of tyranny. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of amusement and admiration. Kerren's face flushed with anger as she attempted to regain control. "This is an outrageous spectacle, Jordan," she snapped, her tone forced and brittle. "You're undermining the integrity of our community." But her words rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence and the palpable support emanating from the crowd. Board members exchanged uncertain looks, and even a few long-suffering neighbors dared to smile at the absurdity of the situation. Outside the town hall, whispers of chili pumpkins spread like wildfire. For many residents, Jordan's bold act was a beacon of hope, a reclamation of individuality in a community strangled by red tape. In the midst of Kerren's calculated overreach, he had not only defended his land, but he had also ignited a movement. As the meeting adjourned in a mix of outrage and reluctant applause, Jordan knew that this was only the beginning of his counterattack. The fiery glow of his pumpkins promised not just a spicy taste, but a revolution against the cold machinations of a system gone mad. Desperation, when cornered, can drive even the most unyielding figures to madness. For Kerren, the escalating insubordination of Jordan Baxter, and by extension, the growing support for his spicy pumpkin uprising, pushed her to the brink. In a last-ditch attempt to reclaim her authority, she devised a plan that would shock the community and, she hoped, finally silence the man who had become her personal nemesis. It began with a call to the local police department. Kerren claimed that Jordan's unconventional practices had rendered his property a public hazard. In her report, she detailed how the strong aroma of chili oil mingled with what she termed dangerously unregulated vegetation had the potential to disrupt public order. The police, ever cautious in matters involving potential community unrest, agreed to make a routine visit. But in Kerren's mind, this was more than a formality. It was a chance to catch Jordan red-handed, or in this case, pumpkin-handed. Late one cool evening, under a sky heavy with clouds, Kerren decided to take matters into her own hands. Cloaked in the anonymity of night, she stealthily approached Jordan's property with the intention of seizing one of his signature chili-coated pumpkins as evidence of his alleged misdeeds. With trembling hands and a heart pounding with both determination and dread, she snatched a particularly large, glistening pumpkin from the back row, a trophy that would symbolize her supposed victory over his unruly defiance. Unbeknownst to Kerren, Jordan's preparations had extended beyond the public demonstration at the HOA meeting. Hidden cameras discreetly positioned among the pumpkin vines had recorded every illicit movement. Later that night, as Kerren crept back to her car, she couldn't resist taking a furtive bite of the stolen pumpkin. What followed was a moment that would soon be immortalized in neighborhood lore. The fierce, explosive heat of the extra spicy chili oil overwhelmed her senses. Her face contorted in shock, and in a split second, the poise and authority she had clung to for years dissolved into a scene of comic humiliation. The following morning, the community buzzed with news of Kerren's nocturnal escapade. Jordan, ever the tactician, wasted no time in gathering the incriminating footage and arranging a public confrontation. At the next HOA meeting, now packed with neighbors eager for justice, he played the video in its entirety. The screen showed Kerren's furtive movements, her furtive snatch of the pumpkin, and the unforgettable moment when the heat betrayed her. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as her carefully cultivated image of invulnerability shattered before their eyes. Kerren attempted to salvage the situation by insisting that the footage was doctored, that her actions had been misinterpreted. But the evidence was irrefutable. Even the staunchest supporters of the HOA began to waver as the video played repeatedly on the large screen, each replay a nail in the coffin of her credibility. The police, who had initially been inclined to side with Kerren's warnings, were now compelled to re-examine their earlier decision. Her desperate attempt to weaponize law enforcement backfired spectacularly. In the aftermath, Kerren's despicable stunt became the rallying cry for the neighborhood's pent-up frustrations. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags celebrating Jordan's ingenious retaliation. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a modern-day parable of small-town tyranny and triumphant rebellion. For Jordan, this public exposure was the turning point. His fight was no longer about pumpkins alone. It had grown into a battle against systemic overreach and the abuse of power. That day, as Kerren slunk away from the meeting with her reputation in tatters, Jordan addressed the assembled crowd with a calm that belied the turbulence of recent events. "This isn't just about a stolen pumpkin," he declared. "It's about our right to live freely, to celebrate what makes us unique, and to stand up when those in power forget what community truly means." The room erupted in applause, a chorus of vindication that promised change. In that fiery moment, Kerren's final, desperate move had sealed her fate, and the scales of justice began to tip irreversibly in favor of those who had long suffered in silence. As the fallout from Kerren's humiliating misstep rippled through the community, the once impregnable facade of the HOA began to crumble. The tide had turned in ways that even Kerren, ever the meticulous schemer, had not foreseen. What had started as an isolated incident of personal vendetta had ignited a full-scale rebellion against a system steeped in corruption and entitlement. In the weeks that followed, a groundswell of public anger surged. Homeowners, once cowed into submission by Kerren's draconian measures, began to organize. Secret meetings in backyards and community centers gave voice to their shared frustrations. With Jordan's chili-coated pumpkins serving as a potent symbol of defiance, residents banded together to call for a thorough investigation into the HOA's practices. Petitions were circulated, and local media coverage lent the movement an air of legitimacy and urgency. Pressure mounted on the HOA board, and cracks started to show in its once unified front. Several board members, long disillusioned by Kerren's autocratic control and questionable financial practices, began speaking out. During a particularly dramatic meeting convened by concerned residents, one board member, eyes downcast yet resolute, admitted that funds had been misappropriated and that Kerren's decisions had consistently favored her personal interests over the welfare of the community. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly, and murmurs of discontent transformed into demands for accountability. Faced with mounting legal challenges and public outrage, the City Council took notice. An official investigation was launched into the HOA's operations, scrutinizing every contract, fine, and clandestine meeting. Evidence that Jordan had painstakingly gathered over months, recordings, photographs, and testimonies, proved invaluable. It was clear that the HOA had been operating outside the bounds of municipal authority, and Kerren's personal vendetta was only the most visible symptom of a far deeper malaise. Within days, a vote was called among the homeowners. In a historic meeting marked by equal parts relief and righteous fury, the community voted overwhelmingly to remove Kerren from her position as HOA president. The final vote was not just a rejection of one individual's tyranny. It was a bold statement in favor of transparency, fairness, and the right of every homeowner to celebrate their individuality. As Kerren's resignation was announced, she was forced to relinquish her office in a public ceremony that felt more like a defeat than a transition of power. The fallout was swift. The city imposed heavy fines on the HOA for its illegal practices, and several board members faced legal proceedings for their roles in the corruption. In the midst of the chaos, Jordan found himself at the center of the uprising, not as an instigator of discord, but as a beacon of integrity and resilience. He spent quiet evenings poring over legal documents with sympathetic attorneys, ensuring that every wrongful act would be met with a proportionate consequence. His persistence was not driven by vengeance alone. It was the embodiment of a community's desire for justice and renewal. On a crisp, clear morning, as the neighborhood gathered for what had become a celebratory rally, the air was thick with the scent of autumn and the promise of new beginnings. Neighbors exchanged knowing smiles as they recounted the events that had upended their lives, and they credited Jordan's steadfast determination for the change. In the midst of the celebrations, a simple truth emerged. When one person stands up for what is right, it can ignite a fire that burns down even the most oppressive structures. As the community dispersed, there was an unspoken understanding that things would never be the same. The era of unchecked entitlement had ended, and in its place was the promise of a neighborhood where every voice mattered. Jordan Baxter, once a solitary figure battling bureaucracy alone, had sparked a revolution that would be remembered for generations. His victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the enduring power of community spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. In the aftermath of the public uprising, the legal ramifications for the HOA unfolded with relentless precision. The city's investigation had peeled back layers of administrative deceit, revealing a system built on misuse of power and funds. Formal charges were laid, and the once dominant HOA was slapped with fines that dwarfed the petty penalties they had levied on individual homeowners. As lawsuits began to mount, a class action suit was spearheaded by Jordan and several other brave residents who had suffered under Kerren's rule. The courtroom became a battleground for truth, where evidence, meticulously gathered by Jordan, spoke volumes. Photographs of unauthorized inspections, recordings of boardroom conspiracies, and the infamous footage of Kerren's chili pumpkin debacle were presented as irrefutable proof of systematic abuse. Local authorities, now determined to restore faith in community governance, took swift action. The HOA was forced to dissolve, its assets frozen pending a thorough audit. Several board members, implicated in the misappropriation of funds and other irregularities, faced charges that threatened both their careers and reputations. For Jordan, this legal onslaught was not about personal vindication. It was about reclaiming the sanctity of neighborhood living, ensuring that no future resident would suffer the tyranny of unchecked authority. During a follow-up town hall meeting, a sense of cautious optimism permeated the room. Jordan, now seen as a local hero, addressed the crowd with quiet confidence. "Today," he declared, "we stand not just as individuals, but as a united community that refused to be silenced by fear and corruption." His words resonated deeply, and as neighbors nodded in agreement, the collective determination to rebuild a fair and just community grew ever stronger. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved steadily. The audit revealed a litany of irregularities, and the fines imposed were used to set up a community fund dedicated to supporting neighborhood improvements and ensuring transparency in future governance. The final blow to the discredited HOA was delivered when a judge ruled that the organization's practices were in direct violation of state and local laws, officially dissolving it and mandating a complete restructuring of community oversight. For many residents, this legal reckoning was a cathartic moment, a decisive end to years of intimidation and arbitrary punishments. And for Jordan, it was a personal victory that affirmed his belief that courage and persistence could indeed topple even the most entrenched systems of injustice. The legal consequences faced by the HOA were a testament to the power of a community that dared to demand accountability, and they set a precedent for fair governance that would echo through the neighborhood for years to come. As the legal hammer fell on the HOA, the personal consequences for Kerren became increasingly apparent. Once the unchallenged arbiter of suburban conformity, she found herself isolated and discredited, her authority evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. The community that had once trembled under her rule now viewed her as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the perils of unchecked entitlement. Within weeks, Kerren's professional and personal worlds unraveled. The public humiliation of her chili pumpkin fiasco haunted her every step. Former allies distanced themselves, and whispered conversations painted her as a symbol of tyranny gone awry. In meetings with prospective employers, her name was mentioned not with admiration, but with a mix of disbelief and caution. Rumors circulated that she had been blacklisted in the realm of community management, a fate that left her scrambling for a semblance of relevance. Her financial troubles worsened as legal fees mounted, and the fines levied against the HOA were just one piece of the puzzle. Private creditors, now aware of her mismanagement, began calling in debts that had long been hidden behind layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. In a final, bitter twist, even her personal life bore the scars of her downfall. A long-simmering marital discord reached its breaking point, and her husband, embittered by her relentless ambition and the public disgrace, sought a divorce that would further strip her of any remaining dignity. Isolated, humiliated, and facing a future devoid of power or prestige, Kerren's once immaculate image crumbled irreparably. The community's response, though measured in the courtroom, was unrelenting in its social repercussions. Neighbors who had once feared her wrath now greeted her with knowing looks on the street, a silent verdict of moral superiority. The downfall of Kerren was as complete as it was inevitable. In quiet moments of reflection, Jordan would catch a glimpse of her in passing, a brief, awkward encounter that served as a reminder of how the abuse of power could be met with equally resolute justice. There was no vindictive glee in his eyes, only a profound sadness that such a once respected figure had allowed her own insecurities and thirst for control to lead to her ruin. For the community, however, her collapse was a liberation, a reclaiming of space and spirit that had long been suppressed by her draconian rule. By the time the final legal documents were signed and Kerren officially exited the stage of public life, the neighborhood had already begun to heal. Her personal downfall, public and unadorned, stood as a beacon of poetic justice, a living lesson in the power of unity and the triumph of individual spirit over oppressive conformity. Autumn had long passed, yet the echoes of that fiery season still resonated through the once oppressive neighborhood. Jordan Baxter's pumpkin patch, now fully restored and thriving, had become a vibrant symbol of renewal and defiance. Neighbors strolled along the garden path with an air of quiet pride, recalling not just the spicy showdown, but the collective journey toward reclaiming their community soul. A modest autumn festival had been organized in the wake of the upheaval, a celebration of creativity, unity, and the power of speaking truth to power. Lanterns hung from trees, and stalls showcased local produce, crafts, and naturally, an assortment of pumpkins. Jordan's chili-coated pumpkins, once instruments of revenge, were now celebrated as culinary curiosities. Some dared to sample them, laughing at the fiery challenge, while others simply admired the bold statement they represented. In a light-hearted moment that captured the spirit of the new era, an elderly neighbor approached Jordan with a mischievous glint in her eye, clutching an absurdly official-looking HOA violation notice. Printed on recycled paper and decorated with cartoonish images of pumpkins, she half-joked, "Looks like someone forgot to follow the rules again." The assembled crowd erupted in laughter, and Jordan, with a playful smile, replied, "Well, I suppose I'll have to start my own set of guidelines, one that celebrates, rather than stifles, our freedom to be ourselves." As the festivities wound down and twilight descended over the neighborhood, the final mic drop moment came not with thunderous applause, but with a gentle, resolute affirmation of what had been achieved. Jordan sat on his back porch, the soft glow of string lights illuminating his weathered face. He sipped a cup of warm cider, reflecting on the journey, a battle waged not merely with legal documents and defiant acts, but with the unyielding belief that every home, every garden, every soul deserved a chance to flourish in its own unique way. In that quiet moment, the legacy of the past season was cemented. The neighborhood, once hemmed in by arbitrary rules and the iron grip of entitlement, now thrived on its newfound sense of community and individuality. And as a gentle breeze stirred the last of the fallen leaves, Jordan whispered a simple truth to the night: "We've reclaimed our home." The screen faded to black as the distant sound of laughter and conversation mingled with the rustle of leaves, a final indelible mic drop that declared unequivocally that tyranny had been overcome by the warmth, spice, and unbreakable spirit of a united community.